And before we go to Q&A, I just wanted to say something about Ray, since I forgot to introduce him. He's a fourth-year PhD student at both University of Lisbon in Portugal and University of Santa Catarina in Brazil. And this is important. He's about to graduate and enter the job market in the first half of 2022. He is obviously, as you've seen, passionate about BFT systems, blockchain technology, and decentralization. So let's take a look at Slack, Zoom. No questions so far. So maybe I ask, we have one. Okay, so Shudong, go ahead. I think you were already, yes.
Great work. And I'm actually curious about how we decide the number of beans. So if like the number of failed nodes is actually more than the number of beans, and every bean contains at least one failed node, so that you can already construct a tree with like all the internal nodes is fault-free. So in that case, what will happen? Will Kauri actually redivide the nodes into beans and reselect a bean? Sorry, it seems that I cannot hear you.
Yeah, I don't see Ray.
So maybe there's some audio issue.
No. I see Ray actually. Go ahead.
But, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Your audio is volume is quite low.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. That's a good question. Yes. So that's something that was difficult to pack into the short video. But if there is a larger number of failures, then we can optimally reconfigure. Then we fall back to hot stuff. Basically.
Oh, I see. Thank you. Thank you.
So at this point, we have a second question. Sujanya, please go ahead.
Hi, great talk and awesome work. Does the optimal tree configuration take into consideration other things like maybe internode message propagation latency or the heterogeneity of the ordering nodes hardware? Or do you think it, like, other than just failures, do you think of other things that make the choice of optimal committee better?
That's also a good question. And it's actually something that we are basically doing as part of the future work. So the current work only considered just divides the nodes into random bins, and we're working on a future work to construct the bins based on things like latency and bandwidth or CPU capabilities as well.
That's awesome. Thank you.
I'm not seeing any more questions. We have a few minutes. Nenad, you should have been promoted. Yes, go ahead, please, Nenad.
Yes, great. Do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Ray. Great talk and work. I just wanted to ask you, like, since you're using three topology, three structure, and basically, if I understood correctly, you need to have a leader that is good, and also all internal nodes needs to be good. So basically, the probability that you will need to do a reconfiguration is higher than in star overlay, in star topology, because in star topology, only if the leader is bad, you need to reconfigure. But in three, if any of the internal nodes is bad, you need to reconfigure. Do you have some evaluation how this can impact the performance, maybe, or something along those lines?
No, that is a correct observation. Yes, like the more internal nodes we have, the higher the potential impact is of more faulty nodes, and the more likely it is that we have to reconfigure. So that we considered actually the importance of the moment we found a robust tree, we will be executing the protocol, so that we've had a bigger focus on finding a robust tree and didn't do an evaluation of the probabilities of the failure impacts, which is also something we have planned for the future work as well.
Okay, nice. Thank you.
Thank you, Nenad. We have a few minutes. I'm just gonna check here. I have to say that this brings memory of overlay tree construction from me from 20 years ago. So I'm curious, have you evaluated your system in a heterogeneous network setting where latencies are not so uniform?
Yeah, yes, we also executed it in a heterogeneous setting where we saw also a larger latency with the tree, but because of the pipelining, we were able to still deliver a very high throughput. But yes, if the trees are not very well configured, taking like the question earlier into account, then we will have a larger client-side latency. So it makes sense to have an algorithm that properly adjusts the tree to have more like the works from overlay tree construction, to have closer nodes more together, to have a smaller latency.
Great, thank you.
Okay, hello everyone indeed. Thank you for the great talk, Ray. Let's see if there's any questions from the audience. And I think we have one from Choi. So Choi, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it was a great talk. Thanks, Ray. Yeah, I'm curious if there is any limitations in terms of the number of the pins and how the Kauri handled the case that the number of 14 nodes is bigger than the number of the pins. Yeah.
That's a great question. It's also something we discuss exhaustively in the paper. At the current level, we require the number of faults to be smaller than the fan out of the system, so that to achieve optimal reconfiguration steps and to fall back to a tree, we require smaller numbers of failures. Now, that doesn't mean that we lose any liveness or safety, but if the number of faults is too big, we have to fall back to a star topology or just much smaller tree. That is also one of the things we are currently working on for the future, so that we are currently having some ideas on how we can significantly improve that to tolerate significantly more failures and still maintain a tree and optimal reconfiguration.
I see. Thanks.
All right. Other questions, please, again, raise your hand on Zoom if you want to ask your question in person, or put it in the pinned thread on Slack if you would prefer me to read out your question. So I have a question, Ray, about Kauri, which is that this pipelining idea, is for blockchains, perhaps, you did in a new way, but in systems, that's an old idea, right? We've done pipelining in all sorts of settings in order to improve utilization. But to some extent, I'm curious what the trade-off is here, right? Because it seems just so obvious that to do that in a blockchain setting where you have these, long latencies and you have to wait for things to take a long time to propagate. So I'm wondering if there's anything you give up by doing this pipelining that, previous systems, any property that previous systems had that, Kauri can no longer have because it pipelines so aggressively. There would probably be something related to dependencies between the blocks that are being pipelined or something like that. But I'm curious about your perspective on that.
Can I quickly interject this question, or intercept, I should say, since you're asking this, Matos? Hot stuff, the one hot stuff you evaluate is also using pipelined hot stuff or not? So that kind of ties into Matos' question. So I skipped ahead.
Yeah, thanks for piggybacking.
Yes. So yes, we're using the piggybacked version of hot stuff. So the pipeline, we are evaluating using the pipeline version. And so there are two elements to this. First of all, those are optimistic blocks. So in the case of a failure, like we saw in the last graph, we will have to throw away the optimistic blocks and then have to roll back a little bit and then start over again. So it significantly improves the throughput, but the client-side latency because of the tree is still a little bit higher. And I think the most interesting element, and it also ties again in the question of Florian, is that this aggressive pipelining is actually only possible because of the tree. That's kind of this thing of like, the load balancing of the tree gives us additional resources. Like in the original hot stuff paper, with 100 processes, they reached 8 gig of bandwidth usage already. So that in a practical system, or especially geographic distributed system, wouldn't be possible. So, and that is because of the large fan out and sending blocks. So like if you have a 1 MB block and you have to send to 100 members, that's already 100 MB bandwidth per block you have to send. And if we have a fan out of 10, we can produce 10 times as much blocks. So that is kind of like the pipeline is only possible because of the tree, and the trade-off is basically having to sometimes roll back a little bit.
Florian, looks like you have a follow-up.
Yes, so following right up on this, I assume it's not something you actually said in the paper, but I assume since you build this on hot stuff, this tree message passing takes the place of each broadcast in the rounds of hot stuff, right?
Yes.
So
we're actually doing double pipelining. We're using hot stuff's
that was
pipelining.
My question. Exactly.
We're using hot stuff's pipelining and our pipelining. Exactly. That's why we call it a pipelining stretch.
Yes, so I don't even have to ask my question. That was exactly it.
I kind of saw that coming.
Cool. So another pipelining related question. So you had this very nice visualization, and you talked about in the talk about how you calculate the degree of pipelining that you can afford, basically based on some understanding of latencies in the system and the stretch, etc. But latencies, especially in a wide area setting, are notoriously variable, right? This is something that's very hard to have any deterministic handle on. So I'm curious how Kauri deals with the uncertainty and the variance in latencies, right? Because if you get this wrong, if you pipeline too much, you create congestion, right? If you pipeline too little, you underutilize resources, but latencies vary all the time. So it seems very hard to tell, particularly in wide area environments.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question as well. So the model is obviously more like a baseline and something we especially used in the context of configuring our experiments, etc. In a practical system in production, would probably use then a model as the baseline of the system, and would then track the latency of the system, and then attempt to detect congestion. If there's congestion, reduce the pipelining, and if there's leftover resources at the internal nodes, we increase the pipelining. It would be then more something variable, which is something we have planned looking into for future work as well.
Right, but latency is also not a single property of the system, right? Some individual nodes might have much higher latency than others because they have poorer connections, or there's something going on. The endpoint's overloaded. Some transcontinental internet cable is overloaded, right? So you could also have variance at different points in the tree, right? And that would affect your performance as well. Is that something that we could capture in the model in the future? It sounds like you don't capture it currently. Correct me if I'm wrong, but is that something that you would need to take into account for production deployment?
Yeah, yes. Currently, we're assuming also a homogeneous network, which is also exactly the thing we are working on for the future for heterogeneous networks, and then also something we've been discussing a lot, building trees that are more intelligent as well. So shuffling bins in a way such that we're having geographic nodes with lower latency closer together. But there's a lot of additional things we can be building around Kauri for sure.
Right, and if you did this, you would increase your pipelining potential somewhat further. And cool. Florian, you had briefly had your hand up there. Did you?
Yeah, you answered it too. Yeah.
Okay, great.